David's going to speak for about 40 or 45 minutes, after which we'll collect any comments or questions you have for him on cards we've left on your seats. And because we are taping tonight, we do ask that you use the cards for your comments so that we can read them into the microphone and get it properly taped. Also, we know that the issue is very controversial and people have strong feelings about it, but we're not here tonight to settle 60 years of disputed history. And unless Obama has somebody on their speed dial, we're also not here to set U.S. policy. We're just here to hear about David's experiences, try to educate ourselves a little bit, and continue doing that afterwards. David Goodner has been an activist and a journalist for his entire adult life, or as long as I've known him. He's been an active and central member of the local anti-war movement since before the start of the war in Iraq, and he's written about peace and justice issues for the Daily Iowan, the Press Citizen, and the Des Moines Register. He's helped organize and participated in protests of the bank bailouts and is now active in the Catholic worker movement in Des Moines. Tonight he's going to speak about his roles as both an activist and a journalist during his 3-week trip to Palestine in December. So please welcome David Goodner.
Can you guys hear me? Is that coming through the mic? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. There wouldn't be much of a point in me talking tonight if I was speaking to an empty room, so I really appreciate all the members of the audience taking time out of their day to come to this event, especially during the tough winter weather. I also wanted to thank People for Justice in Palestine, the University of Iowa Anti-War Committee, and the Iowa City Public Library for inviting me to speak and for organizing the event. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge any allies that may be in the room from organized labor, human rights groups, NGOs, grassroots community organizations, and social movements for peace and justice. The work you all do on a daily basis is crucial to the functioning of American democracy. That is, if we can assume that our democracy is functioning. And if it's not, you all will be an integral part of the solution. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge those in the room who no doubt are on the other side of the issue than I am. Although we may disagree on virtually everything, I want you to know that I am listening. Your voices are being heard. So the format for this speech is going to go as follows. My basic premise tonight is that a fledgling nonviolent popular resistance movement in occupied Palestine, organized by a coalition of Palestinians, left-wing Israelis, and international solidarity activists, is mounting a credible challenge to the occupation, and that it has the potential to change the fundamental power dynamics that undergird the conflict in ways that benefit and favor Palestinian civil society. The real question is whether it can survive long enough to ignite into a truly mass movement for liberation. It is also my contention that Israel is doing everything in its power, by hook or by crook, to make sure that this burgeoning nonviolent movement is brutally repressed into oblivion. I took 3 weeks of vacation in December of 2009 and traveled to occupied Palestine with the International Solidarity Movement. This was not my first experience in an armed conflict zone. In 2008, I traveled to Colombia twice for a total of 15 weeks to volunteer with Justice and Peace, a human rights accompaniment organization that works with internally displaced subsistence farmers threatened with continued violence by paramilitary and state security forces. Although the pro-Israeli crowd likes to claim that critics of the occupation are holding Israel to a higher standard than we hold other countries, I have to respectfully disagree. I am holding the Israeli government to the same standard that I hold the Colombian government and the United States government. Occupation is a crime. From Afghanistan to Colombia to Haiti to Iraq to Pakistan to Somalia to Yemen to Palestine. I want to take a minute and define what I mean when I say protective accompaniment. I call it Chuck Norris without karate kicks. It's basically being a bodyguard without a gun. The Christian Peacemaker Teams calls protective accompaniment nonviolent third-party intervention or reducing violence by getting in the way. One CPTer who has worked for years in Hebron wrote, I'm on the side of whoever the gun is pointed at. And I think that's a very profound statement. Peace Brigades International uses the following tactical map to visually describe the protective accompaniment model. And if there's questions about it, we can answer them during the Q&A. As I wrote at the time on my blog, I did not travel to the Holy Land on a fact-finding mission, nor do I intend for this speech to demonstrate even a pretense of impartiality or objectivity. And here I would like to cite the late historian Howard Zinn, who in Chapter 1 of his book, A People's History of the United States, wrote that there is no such thing as objectivity. The taking of sides is inevitable in all scholarship, and rather than choosing to ignore this reality or to pretend that it doesn't exist, I instead choose to admit my bias up front with the understanding that after the admission is made, we can move past it, and that you and the audience are smart enough to decide for yourselves which side speaks to the truth in your hearts. So to continue, I want to lay out a basic framework for how I view the conflict. I did not invent this frame, nor do I claim that it is beyond debate. Because we do not have much time tonight to delve into the complexities of this or that way of framing the conflict, I can only encourage all of us to take the time to investigate and to research the matter on our own, and to decide for ourselves what speaks to us and what does not. Although I respect the Israeli right to national self-determination and readily acknowledge the existence of Israel, I believe that both Zionism and the birth of the nation-state of Israel are marked by the original sin of the ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians from their native land, a colonial settler project of territorial expansion, annexation, apartheid, and Jim Crow that continues to this day in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Here again, I should emphasize that those who label Israel an apartheid state or reference Jim Crow are not holding it to a higher standard than we do other countries. Indeed, we are merely holding Israel to the same standard which we hold apartheid South Africa and Jim Crow South of the United States. I called my method of reporting Jesus journalism, partly because I was in occupied Palestine over Christmas, partly because I just liked the wordplay, but mostly because I chose to intentionally give preferential treatment to the perspectives of the poor, the occupied, and the oppressed. Jesus was born in the lowest class of his time, a poor refugee in an occupied country, and he was persecuted by the powers that be from his birth until his death. The Israeli shelling of Gaza last year was akin to the biblical slaughter of the holy innocents, and nonviolent resistors are crucified on a regular basis in the West Bank. I found Jesus in the modern-day Holy Land, and I found him among the Palestinians. I took this idea from the theory of liberation theology that was developed by Catholic priests in Latin America during the dirty wars of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. In places like Chile, Argentina, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and others, Catholic priests use biblical metaphors to help the poor and oppressed not only understand the predicament of their lives, but to inspire them to rise up and resist it. According to this metaphor, the dictatorships of the time represented the ruling elite, the Pharisees, King Herod, and Pontius Pilate. The United States, who funded the right-wing paramilitary death squads, represented the Roman Empire. And the poor, oppressed campesinos, the farmers living in abject poverty who were disappeared by the military juntas, represented Jesus. It is the same in Israel and occupied Palestine. And because this metaphor has been used both credibly and consistently to help to explain and to understand numerous armed conflicts spanning decades and continents, I reject the allegation made by critics that this metaphor, when applied to Israel, is somehow anti-Semitic. I believe that the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestine exists today only because of the continued financial, military, and diplomatic support of the United States, which is the 21st century Roman Empire. I believe that support, measured in billions of dollars of military aid a year, is given because it serves U.S. national security interests to have a proxy army in the oil-rich region of the Middle East. As an American citizen and taxpayer, the blood of both the Israeli and the Palestinian people is on my hands. And I traveled to Palestine and volunteered with the International Solidarity Movement in part to say, not in my name. I arrived in Jerusalem on December 11th and quickly began nonviolent direct action and protective accompaniment training with the International Solidarity Movement. The 2-day training was similar to other trainings I've done with Witness for Peace, the Christian Peacemaker teams, and the Des Moines Catholic Worker. We did a lot of role-playing and had workshops on our hopes and fears, ISM's organizational structure, consensus and affinity group decision-making, Palestinian culture, security, power and privilege, know your weapons, de-escalation and de-arrest techniques, legal, the history of nonviolent resistance in Palestine, and more. Another workshop was called Responding to Military Actions. During a protest in the West Bank, the Israeli occupation forces' first response is to announce the area as a restricted military zone off-limit to protesters. If demonstrators refuse to disperse, riot police will form a line to push protesters back. The proper response from demonstrators is to form your own line and either link arms or sit down or both. If the riot police are unable to push the demonstrators back, they will usually escalate to using concussion grenades and flash bombs. Concussion grenades are orange grenades that are made up of plastic and detonate 3.5 seconds after the pin is pulled. They make a loud sound that can cause people who are unprepared for them to panic. The proper response is to take 1 or 2 steps away from where the grenade lands, turn your back, yell concussion grenade, and plug your ears with your fingers. Flash bombs are black and silver and made of metal. They're thinner than the orange concussion grenades and less noisy, but they explode in 1.5 seconds, and they shoot fire out of the bottom of the canister. The next step on the escalation of force chart for the Israeli occupation forces is to use tear gas. There are several different types of tear gas canisters. Some are made of rubber and are either thrown by hand or shot out of the M16 rifle. These have a maximum range of 30 meters. There are also silver tear gas canisters that can be fired from a launcher attached to the M16 rifle. Legally, these cannot be fired at a distance less than 40 meters and cannot be aimed directly at protesters, but occupation forces have and will fire them at any time from any distance. A third kind is the high-velocity tear gas canister that nearly killed Tristan Anderson and is responsible for the death of at least one other Palestinian protester in the West Bank. These are also fired from the M16. A fourth kind of tear gas is fired from a box attached to a Jeep that can fire 40 to 50 tear gas canisters at a time. Tear gas is a psychological weapon that tricks your brain into thinking you can't breathe. It also burns your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your throat, and your lungs. The best way to nullify them is to stay calm, don't panic, watch where the wind is blowing, have an escape route planned in advance, to cover your face with a bandana or a kufiya, and use vinegar or an onion to negate the effects of the gas. Occupation forces can also escalate to shooting demonstrators with rubber bullets and rubber-coated steel bullets. These are also fired from an M16 with a longer barrel and a red or yellow label on the magazine cartridge. Rubber bullets are not legally allowed to be fired at a distance less than 100 meters, but occupation forces have and will fire them at any time from any distance. Snipers generally fire rubber-coated steel bullets at people they deem to be active leaders, people with bullhorns or flags, as well as youth throwing stones. The best response to rubber bullet fire is to turn around, put your head down, and cover your head. They're too fast to dodge, so it's best to take the fire in the back so it misses your vital organs. Wearing thick clothes can also help. Occupation forces can also fit an attachment to the bottom of their M16 rifles that allows them to shoot 20 to 25 rubber bullets at once. These are meant to be deployed against large crowds. During the Second Intifada, more than 200 Palestinians were killed with these less than lethal weapons. The occupation forces have also recently been using high-pressure water cannons. These shoot water containing chemicals that either burn your skin like tear gas or smell like raw sewage or both. The use of live ammunition is illegal under Israeli law during protests where either Israelis and internationals are present. It's proof that protective accompaniment works because the Israeli army themselves de-escalate the situation. Of course, the soldiers sometimes use live ammunition anyway. After our training ended, I spent the first week on night patrol in an occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, accompanying 2 Palestinian families who erected protest tents outside of their homes after they were forcibly evicted from them by the Israeli government and right-wing Jewish settlers. The Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem was built by the UN and Jordanian governments in 1956 to house 28 Palestinian refugee families from the 1948 war. The people who I stayed with then had been forcibly evicted from their homes by the Israeli occupation forces not once, but twice. Nabeel Al-Kurd, the patriarch of one of the 28 families in the neighborhood who have either been evicted or threatened with it, told me, quote, "On December 1st, 60 soldiers came to my house and smashed all of my furniture. They pushed my mother and beat her. My mother is 85 years old. She was taken to the hospital. From then until now, every day there is trouble, fighting and shouting." Nabeel Al-Kurd has set up a protest tent on the paved entrance that divides the front section of the house from the back section. Every night he uses the furniture that was smashed by the Israeli police during his eviction to fuel a fire to keep his family and international accompaniers warm during the cold nights. We sit in this stand right inside the gate because we are afraid if we leave, they will take more ground and we will lose the rest of our house, he told me. The International Solidarity Movement maintains a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week presence in the neighborhood because the families living there face daily harassment and threats by the Israeli settlers. Israeli police and military forces also maintain a permanent vigil on the street. The Al-Kurd family is only one of several families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood that have been forcibly evicted from their homes to allow Israeli settlers to gain a foothold in the predominantly Palestinian neighborhoods in occupied East Jerusalem. On August 2nd, the Israeli forces evicted 2 other Palestinian families from their houses after they demolished the gates of the houses and forced the families out at gunpoint. Several of the family members were seriously wounded during the encounter. Nasser Al-Gawi has also constructed a protest tent outside of his old house and has maintained a permanent vigil across the street since August 2nd. Clashes between the Israeli settlers and Palestinian refugees in the neighborhood are frequent and ongoing. In the short time I stayed in the neighborhood, I witnessed almost constant harassment at all times of the day and night. The settlers hang Israeli flags from the Palestinian houses, swarm the neighborhood with dozens of young men, many of whom are armed with assault rifles, walk the streets with large unmuzzled dogs, shout obscenities at the residents of the protest tents, physically assault Palestinians, usually in mobs, and throw rocks and bricks through the windows of Palestinian homes. The Israeli military and police forces are generally present, watching, and do nothing. Nasser testified in front of the U.S. Congress about the situation in Sheikh Jarrah and calls Israeli policy in occupied East Jerusalem the Judaization of Al-Quds. Al-Quds is Arabic for Jerusalem. The name of the game is ethnic cleansing, he told me while we sat in the front of his campfire and shared tea around 1 a.m. one morning. Israel wants the Palestinians out of East Jerusalem so they can claim the capital as their own. According to several international solidarity movement activists who have spent months providing protective accompaniment to the residents in Sheikh Jarrah, the aim of both the Israeli government and the settlers is to turn the whole area into a new Jewish settlement, to create a Jewish continuum that will effectively cut off the old city from the northern Palestinian neighborhoods and change the facts on the ground to preempt final status negotiations. Territorial annexation and the transfer of civilian populations into occupied territory is illegal under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Both the UN and the Obama administration are publicly opposed to Israeli policy in East Jerusalem, and they say that the forced evictions and displacements undermine the peace process. The UN in particular counters the Israeli argument about Jewish property rights by noting that international law takes precedence over Israeli state and municipal law. If Israelis have pre-48 property rights, so do the Palestinians. To claim otherwise, as Israel does, is blatant apartheid. Until a viable nation-state of Palestine is established, the relevant law of the land is the Geneva Conventions. After a state of Palestine is established, property rights should be settled by the Palestinian courts and the Palestinian legal system. One night in Sheikh Jarrah, a young Palestinian man wearing a red and white kufiya, baggy pants, and a sideways New York Yankees hat stopped by to supplement our vigil during the late night hours. "My name is Abraham," he said, smiling. "You know the prophet Abraham? Well, I am not him." He laughed. Over the next few hours, Abraham told me that he had lived in Sheikh Jarrah for 7 years and was now a cook at a nearby restaurant. He dreams of becoming a successful rap superstar. "I want to have a good life, a good job, and a beautiful wife," he said, "but all around me are walls." Every time I climb on top of one and jump over, there is another wall in front of me. Another night, a taxi driver named Abdullah and I spent the better part of the night drinking tea, feeding the campfire, and keeping watch, and we eventually got into a conversation about religion. According to Abdullah, Western efforts to promote democracy in the Middle East are destined for failure because Western liberal democracies are ignorant of Islam and Islamic history. Islam is a political and a personal way of life, Abdullah said. For the last 1,400 years, it is how we have organized our societies. It is not like capitalism's conquest of religion in Europe and America, where religion is now strictly a private and personal thing for most people. No. For us, Islam is a political way of life as well as a personal way of life. There is no such thing as a secular politician because in our culture, secularism has no legitimacy with the people. Islam is compatible with democracy, but it cannot be excluded from it. It must be integrated. I asked Abdullah if he viewed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a religious lens. No, he said. The Prophet Muhammad teaches Muslims to love all people of the book, Jews, Muslims, and Christians. We do not have hate in our hearts for anybody or any religion, but when the Israelis come to steal our land, we must fight them. And we will fight them the right way, non-violently, through popular resistance. On Thursday, December 17th, I documented the violent dispersal of a peaceful Palestinian cultural celebration in Jerusalem. This was a real wake-up call for me. It was my first taste of how brutal the occupation really is. The cultural celebration was organized by the Al-Quds Community Action Center and was meant to mark Jerusalem's designation as the 2009 Arab Cultural Capital of the World by the United Nations. I want to stress that this was a cultural celebration and not a protest. According to the Man News Agency, quote, the celebration was intended to be a year-long event sponsored by the Arab League, Al-Quds Capital of Arab Culture, but was officially banned by Israel. The festival was marred by arrests and police raids. Israeli forces also broke up a march planned by Palestinian scout troops and closed schools where cultural events were taking place. Soldiers also surrounded the French Cultural Center and the British Council, where simultaneous events were planned as the finale of the cultural celebration. At least 9 people were arrested, as well as one international solidarity activist who tried to de-arrest an unlawfully detained Palestinian. According to event organizers, 8 buses of people were also prevented by authorities from joining the demonstration. This is what I wrote at the time. I've never seen anything so messed up in my life. Any Palestinian man who dared to open his mouth to sing songs, dance, or chant slogans was immediately beaten and arrested. Chant leaders were targeted by snatch squads made up of police and army soldiers and beaten and detained without the slightest hint of pretense or justification. An old woman who started screaming after her son was arrested was kicked in the face by a police officer. News reporters and photographers were thrown to the ground if they got in the soldiers' way. Any Palestinian male who yelled at the security forces or protested the violence of the state was immediately assaulted and arrested. The apartheid state security forces acted with a vicious precision that left the crowd in shock. Women and girls were crying with grief. Tears were streaming down their faces. It was an overwhelming display of brute force and repression by a police state more often expected in a place like Iran than in the, quote, only democracy in the Middle East. While I was in Palestine, there were all these protests going on in Iran, and we would sit and watch the international TV coverage and marvel at the outpouring of international sympathy for the Iranian protesters and the overwhelming condemnation of the repression doled out by the Iranian security forces. The same thing happens in Palestine every day, but nobody cares. When Iranians take to the streets, some of them putting up blockades, burning tires, and throwing stones at the police, CNN International admits that these are essentially nonviolent actions and gives them overwhelmingly positive news coverage. When the Palestinians do the same thing, they're called terrorists. There is a double standard in this conflict, but it is not Israel that is being treated unfairly. After the cultural celebration was repressed, it became clear to me that Israel does not recognize Palestinian human rights to free speech, assembly, or cultural expression. I'm going to play a couple quick clips of this demonstration so you get at least a taste of what I'm talking about. This is what the Palestinian celebration essentially was. Tell me if you can respond. people having a good time.
Is the guy holding the flag the same guy who was in that previous picture being arrested?
No. This is one video clip I took when the police started to crack down. It's by no means as comprehensive, and you have to understand that, I had my camera focused in one area, but this was happening all around me as this happened. Make it full screen. This is pure chaos.
עתיקים, זוז כבר. זוזי, זוז. היי! בלי ידיים! זוזי מפה! זוזי! מרקה הבוקי!
Event organizer Najwa Sawadi told me, quote, "It is forbidden for Palestinians to celebrate their identity and culture in Jerusalem. The community was not aggressive towards anybody. We only wanted to give our people the chance to take pride in their culture and national identity for a few hours, and this is how they react. This is the reality of the Israeli occupation." The very next day, 26 Israeli peace activists and one international solidarity activist were arrested and 3 Palestinian children wounded during a nonviolent demonstration against the Israeli settlement project in Sheikh Jarrah. Over 300 people, most of them members of the left-wing Israeli organizations Anarchists Against the Wall and Rabbis for Human Rights, attended the weekly vigil. The apartheid state security forces blocked the roads leading into Sheikh Jarrah in an attempt to prevent protesters from reaching the neighborhood. But the demonstrators successfully broke through police lines by splitting into feeder marches and descending onto Sheikh Jarrah from the side streets, back alleyways, and rugged landscape behind the neighborhood. When the demonstrators reformed their line and stood face-to-face with the police, protesters sat down, linked arms, and sang anti-occupation chants in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. Police then moved in and began arresting people one by one. I'm going to show you a couple quick clips here, too. I don't speak Hebrew, so if anybody knows what this guy's saying, let me know. And here's just a quick footage of some of the I've got more on my blog if you guys want to see more video from these things. One organizer said, quote, "This event represents a legitimate and nonviolent protest of Palestinian, international, and Israeli activists against the ongoing campaign of evicting Palestinian families from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. The police have been brutally dispersing these peaceful protests for weeks, while the Palestinian families live in constant fear of violent settler attacks." One Israeli anarchist who refused to give her name or city of origin grabbed the bullhorn and said, "We are here today and every Friday to demand an end to the occupation of Sheikh Jarrah by the Israeli government and Jewish settlers. We call on the Israeli government to dismantle all settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. We are not using any violence. The only violence here today is the violence the police are using on us." Towards the end of the protest, a group of nearly 100 settlers entered the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and began throwing rocks at a house of a nearby Palestinian family. One 12-year-old Palestinian boy was also chased into the street and beaten by settlers. 3 Palestinian children were taken to a nearby hospital for treatment. The Israeli occupation forces stood by and watched and did nothing. And unfortunately, I don't have any video footage of this because I was in the middle trying to break it up. I asked a member of Anarchists Against the Wall why her organization came to the protest. She refused to give her name, but said she was from Tel Aviv and that the anarchist organization counts more than 200 people as members. "You will probably get a different answer from every one of us," she said. "But for the most part, we talk about things like apartheid, occupation, and the racist nature of the Zion state." These are her words, not mine. The next day, I left Sheikh Jarrah and traveled to the Palestinian village of Bel Ain and Naileen near Ramallah. Bel Ain and Naileen have had over half of their traditional farming land annexed to Israel by the apartheid wall. Israeli settlements now dominate the landscape. The village popular committees are independent of the traditional political parties and have organized weekly protests against the wall for years and are now international symbols of the nonviolent Palestinian popular resistance. Over 100 residents of the two villages have been arrested in the last 6 months during a night raid campaign by Israel. The night raids target young Palestinian boys accused of throwing stones at the wall and organizers of the popular committees. Many young Palestinian men have been shot and killed with live ammunition or high-velocity tear gas canisters at these two demonstrations. International solidarity activists in Belaïn and Nylin patrol the towns every night in an attempt to mitigate and document the raids by the state security forces. I'm going to read from my blog now from an entry dated Tuesday, December 22nd. Sorry. I was woken up with a start around 1 o'clock in the morning by Eyad Bornat, a community organizer for the Belaïn Committee for Popular Resistance Against the Wall and Settlements, Haitham Al-Khatib, the media coordinator for Friends of Freedom and Justice Belaïn, 4 young Palestinian men, and an American Jewish anarchist who called herself Storm. Are you ready? Haitham asked me. Yeah, let's go, I said. We set off on a brisk pace through the village, past a small grove of olive trees, and headed southwest to a home on the edge of Belaïn that doubles as a lookout post during the nightly patrols. The village behind me was dark in the night, but off to the west, the lights of an Israeli settlement shone with all the trappings of a modern first world city. Between Belaïn and the settlement lay the apartheid wall and several settler-only roads. An army jeep off in the distance scanned the village with a giant spotlight. A surveillance tower even further west recorded the movements of Belaïn's population and possibly recorded the sounds of conversations as well. The settlement was built on Belaïn land, Haitham told me. I had arrived in Belaïn 12 hours earlier and was dropped off near the village mosque and taken to Eyad Bornat's house by his young son. He told me a story over a cup of hot tea. This is Belaïn, a small village of Palestine, Eyad began. The nonviolent popular resistance did not start in Belaïn. It started in historical Palestine in 1936. The first Intifada was also nonviolent, and we had all of the people with us in our resistance. I was arrested for the first time during the first Intifada when I was 17 years old. I spent 2 years in jail then, plus another year under house arrest, he said. Our village began demonstrating in 2005 when the Israelis started uprooting all of our olive trees. You know, Eyad continued, we do not call the wall that they built a security fence because it is not for security. They built it to confiscate our land and our water in order to build new settlements. This is me reading from my blog again. It's nearly 6 o'clock in the morning and we've been on the night patrol for nearly 5 hours. The village roosters have begun to crow and the rosy-fingered dawn is beginning to rise in the east. There's nothing glamorous about protective accompaniment work. Quality conversations aside, standing on watch all night long is incredibly boring. My clothes all reek of campfire smoke, and I spent one sleepless night in Sheikh Jarrah in a vain effort trying to keep a fire lit during the downpour. All I had to show for my efforts was a body and pair of clothes soaked to the bone. Every time I start wishing for a little action to break up the monotony, I have to remind myself that boredom is far preferable to the alternative of settler attacks or police and army raids. The little sleep I do get during the day is marred by a fever I've seemed to catch with symptoms that alternate between either uncontrollable shakes and shivers or profuse sweating. There's a Palestinian that helped keep things in perspective for me. Every day we go to sleep in the morning, Haitham said, so that others may sleep through the night. Not every night was so uneventful. During my time in Belaïn, I documented 2 night raids by the Israeli occupation forces. In the clip I'm about to show you, I'm standing just to the right of the video photographer the whole time. There might not be much sound here. I'm assuming he's telling us to get lost. I don't know. There's not a whole lot of action, but you guys get the idea. I mean, they took him out and they arrested him. This guy comes right up to us and sticks his M16 in our faces. And then they drove off. I was tear-gassed and shot at with less than lethal weapons on Christmas Day in Belayeen and on New Year's Day in Nylene. On Christmas Day, I was arrested in Sheikh Jarrah after I had been tear-gassed in Belayeen. I didn't film the video I'm about to show you, but I can tell you that I was one of the people in the Santa Claus suit. There were 4 or 5 of us. The ornaments on the Christmas tree are spent tear gas canisters.
ليش ما تفرضوا الجهات عليه؟
After the demonstration was over, myself and 2 internationals took a taxi to Jerusalem to catch the weekly demonstration against the settlement project in Sheikh Jarrah. The taxi dropped us off in the middle of the demonstration. More than 300 Israeli anarchists, internationals, and Palestinians were present. But literally within seconds of exiting the taxi, a group of border police and Israeli army soldiers broke through the lines and began arresting people. Both myself and another international from Italy were among those arrested. We were thrown into an unmarked police van and taken to the Shalem police station due south of Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, where we were interrogated and detained for about 6 hours. I don't even know why I'm being arrested, I told one police interrogator. You are being detained because you participated in a demonstration in Sheikh Jarrah, she replied. Is it illegal to have a peaceful demonstration in Israel, I asked. It depends, she replied. This demonstration did not have a license. You refused to grant the demonstrators a permit, I said. But every Friday you let the settlers demonstrate in Sheikh Jarrah and throw rocks at the Palestinians. What's the difference? She ignored me. According to the document I signed, which is on the screen there, I was arrested for interference with the investigation or trial proceedings in danger to the safety of person, public, or state. I was prohibited from entering the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood for the next 15 days on penalty of deportation. According to news reports, 8 demonstrators were arrested on Christmas Day during the demonstration. At the time I wrote on my blog, it's getting harder not to let anger and frustration overwhelm me. Every day I watch more or less uselessly as Palestinians are harassed and assaulted by both the Israeli occupation forces and right-wing paramilitary settlers, state and non-state actors alike who appear to be in open collusion with one another. Labeling the state of Israel as an apartheid state is a gross understatement. Palestinians and even left-wing Israelis are not granted permits to demonstrate, and even the most civil and nonviolent forms of expression and popular resistance are violently repressed at every turn. In contrast, the settlers spew hatred and bigotry at every opportunity, are anti-women, anti-Christian, and definitely anti-Muslim. They are basically given a free pass to deface property, commit vandalism, throw rocks at homes, beat up little children in the streets, throw refugees out of their houses, and worse. The Israeli security apparatus sits by, watches, and does nothing. Every day that I have been here, it gets worse. When human rights workers label Israel a colonial settler apartheid state, we are accused of being Jew-hating anti-Semites. They cite Israeli law, as if we should expect Israeli law to be impartial instead of overwhelmingly biased against the Palestinians. In response, I can only pose this question. Why is it that it is always the Palestinians who are being kicked out of their homes and always the Israeli settlers who are getting new ones? One laughs, the other cries. This conflict is not about religion, it is about economics. It's about land and it's about territory, and it's about power. The international human rights movement has succeeded in restraining the occupation forces. Apart from the carpet bombing of Gaza last year, Israel is now restrained from committing blatant massacres. But the reality is not much better. Through a complex process deemed legal by the apartheid courts, the Palestinian people in occupied East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank are slowly but surely being dispossessed of their homes, their land, and their livelihood. The Palestinians of Gaza have it worse. They're essentially living in an open-air prison. The 6 hours I spent in jail that day was the only highlight I can remember. I shared a jail cell with an Israeli young person who had also been arrested at the protest. He told me that he had immigrated to Israel from Belarus, and that in Belarus he had been taught that the Jewish religion placed an emphasis on bearing witness to social injustice and speaking truth to power, to fighting nonviolently on behalf of the poor and the oppressed and standing up for what's right. But when he moved to Israel, it was like everything he had ever been taught had been flipped upside down. As a Des Moines Catholic worker and someone who follows closely the beliefs of Catholic social justice and liberation theology, I thought it was very fortunate to have been given this opportunity to have a Christian-Jewish dialogue on the topic, especially because it occurred in the middle of an Israeli jail cell between two peace activists who had just been arrested for doing nothing more than standing on a street corner. Since I was banned from returning to Sheikh Jarrah, I headed to Hebron and Nablus for the last week of my travels. I don't really think I have the time to go into much detail here, but I can tell you that I documented the arbitrary imposition of an Israeli roadblock in one village near Nablus that cut off hundreds of Palestinian farmers from their land, and the demolition of a small family business in a second village near Nablus, basically because it was located directly across the street from an illegal Israeli settlement. The apartheid state security forces claimed that the gas station was a security threat. This is worse than apartheid South Africa, one elderly activist from South Africa told me. I also visited a mosque that had been burned to the ground by paramilitary settlers the day I arrived in the country as part of their price tag campaign of terror against the Palestinians. I also interviewed the families of 3 suspected militants from Nablus who had been assassinated. The technical term is extrajudicial execution. We will never know their innocence or guilt of the crimes they were charged with because they were killed in cold blood while they were unarmed and in their own houses before they ever had a chance to stand trial. I want to change gears here and bash Egypt and the Palestinian Authority for a minute. On New Year's Eve, thousands of people in Egypt, the besieged Gaza Strip, Israel, and the occupied West Bank rallied to call for an end to the international blockade and siege of Gaza. But the protests were marred by police brutality in Cairo and the cancellation of a solidarity action in the occupied West Bank town of Tulkrim at the behest of the Palestinian Authority. I was in both Tulkrim and Ramallah that day, and I was also in hourly contact with activists in both Cairo and Bethlehem. In Cairo, Egyptian riot police brutally beat the Gaza Freedom March demonstrators who were unable to enter the Gaza Strip after the Egyptian government permitted less than 100 of the 1,400 participants from crossing the border. Lara Elborno, a Palestinian-American, a University of Iowa alumni, and law student at Loyola University in Chicago, confirmed the reports. They broke a guy's ribs, she told me from Cairo. They beat people with walkie-talkies. My sister Dana got her camera taken away, and they stole the card with her pictures on it. 5 security forces surround her and threw her to the ground. They pulled her hair and punched and kicked her. This is only one of many stories. I've got a real quick clip of it. That was in Cairo, Egypt. Thousands of international activists, Israelis, and Palestinians marched in Gaza, Israel, and across the West Bank. Quote, "We are calling on the people of Palestine to work together to end the occupation," said Iyad Burnat, a community organizer with the Belayeen Popular Committee. "Only by uniting the resistance can we succeed." I don't have the time to go into it tonight, but the Palestinian Authority also tried to limit the marches in Tulkarem and Ramallah that day. They actually succeeded in canceling the one in Tulkarem and claimed it was because of security concerns. Although some people try to claim that Fatah and the PA are somehow behind the nonviolent popular resistance in the West Bank, all the evidence I saw was that they were actively trying to bring the independent popular committees organizing the protests under their control. Although some of the members of the committees are also members of the Fatah political party, just as many are members of the PLFP, PPP, Hamas, and other political parties. There are representatives of all the Palestinian political parties and organizations on the popular committees, and therefore the popular committees are more broadly representative of the Palestinians and Palestinian society than any one party or faction. After I returned home to Des Moines from occupied Palestine, the weekly demonstrations against the wall and settlements in Belayeen, Naileen, and Sheikh Jarrah began to spread to other villages like Iraq Burin, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Masara, and most recently, Nabi Salih. The nonviolent resistance also began to attract the attention of the mainstream American media, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. I encourage all of you to look into these stories online as they corroborate much of what I have said here tonight. There's also an excellent article in a recent issue of The Nation magazine on the same subject that goes into much more depth than the Times and the Post. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, the repression by the Israeli occupation forces is also increasing. Night raids are commonplace, and the number of wounded and arrested demonstrators every week continues to mount. But this indicates to me that the strategy of nonviolent popular resistance is working. Not only is it spreading, but the more Israel attempts to repress it, the more people take the beatings and take the arrests but remain nonviolent, the more international sympathy they win and the more criticism the Israeli military response receives. There is a real potential here for these weekly protests to escalate into a full-fledged, open but nonviolent rebellion, much like the first Intifada in the 1980s. If that happens, the Israeli repression will be severe, and they will do everything in their power to provoke the Palestinians into retaliating with violence. Opportunists and provocateurs in the armed struggle factions of the Palestinian resistance will probably escalate their own violence in return and try to co-opt the mass nonviolent movement for their own ends. So they're facing a very, very difficult and uphill battle. The biggest conclusion I can draw from my time in occupied Palestine is that there will never be peace without a change in the balance of power in the conflict. Israel is a first world country with a modern economy, fully integrated into the contemporary global system, and enjoys the full financial and diplomatic support of the United States. In contrast, the Palestinians are a nation of people without a state. Until the power dynamics undergirding the conflict change, there is little incentive for Israel to grant the kinds of serious concessions that are necessary to make a two-state solution possible. The fledgling nonviolent popular resistance movement represents the best chance at leveraging power away from Israel and the United States and towards Palestinian civil society. And we have a duty to help. All the usual things like letters to the editor, educational events, rallies and protests, and meetings with elected officials should continue. I also highly recommend that all interested parties travel to occupied Palestine themselves and volunteer with organizations like the International Solidarity Movement, the Christian Peacemaker Teams, the Michigan Peace Teams, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Israel and Palestine, Tent of Nations in Bethlehem. I mean, there's dozens of groups there. And see for yourselves what the reality of the occupation is like. But I think the most effective way that we can stand in solidarity with the Palestinians is to join the growing international boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. The BDS movement was first used to end apartheid in South Africa, and it has a historical precedent and a proven track record of success. If we can isolate Israel diplomatically, economically, and culturally from the rest of the world, not because we are anti-Israel, but because we are pro-peace, we can swing the balance of power towards the Palestinian people and do our part to help ensure a world where there is security for Israel and justice for Palestine. Thank you.